It's just after midnight, Tuesday, December 11th, 1962. Picture this. Two men are handcuffed, led from their cells in Toronto's Dawn jail. They only have to walk about 40 feet to the execution chamber. Once they're there, the hangman gets to work. He places them back to back, ties their arms and legs, puts hoods over their heads, and slips the ropes around their necks. And then, with just the pull of a lever, these two men are gone, plunged right into history.
All right, so that's where our story ends, but it's also where we're going to begin. We are going to unpack the entire complicated history of capital punishment in Canada. But we're going to do it a little differently. We'll start with that very last hanging, and then we're going to hit rewind, traveling all the way back through the centuries. Along the way, we'll zero in on one of the most chilling crime sprees you've ever heard of, and we'll even get a look at the grim trade of the hangman. And then we'll see how it all came to an end.
So let's start there, with that final act, the moment the gallows in Canada went silent for good.
Yeah, that quote, it really captures it, doesn't it? The two men were Arthur Ellis and Ronald Turpin, and in those last few moments there in the Dawn jail, it wasn't just their lives that ended. An entire era of Canadian justice, one that went back for centuries, came to a sudden, dramatic stop.
So who were these guys? I mean, what brought them to this point? Well, they were convicted for totally separate crimes. Arthur Ellis, he was a hired gun from Detroit. He was in Toronto on a job to kill a witness. Ronald Turpin, on the other hand, was a local crook. He just robbed a restaurant, and during a traffic stop, he shot and killed a police officer. So you've got two completely different stories, two different paths that somehow ended up at the exact same place at the exact same time with a rope around their necks.
Okay, so that hanging in 1962, it was the final chapter. But it closed a book that was really, really long and often pretty brutal. So let's pull back. Let's zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture of capital punishment in Canada. You can really see how things evolved, right? I mean, it is just wild to think that way back in the 1500s, you could be executed for stealing food. It came from English law, which had, get this, over 1,600 crimes you could be put to death for. It wasn't really until after Confederation in 1867 that Canada started to formalize its own system. And by 1869, they chopped that massive list down to just 3 major offenses: murder, rape, and treason. And the number? Wow, the sheer scale is just staggering. From the time they started keeping official records in 1867, right up to that last execution we talked about, 710 people were executed in Canada. Now, the vast majority were men, 697 to be exact, but 13 women were also sent to the gallows. You have to understand, for almost a century, this wasn't some rare event. It was a routine, grim part of the justice system. Now, to really get a feel for the public mood, to understand the kinds of crimes that led people to the gallows, we have to dive into one specific case. And honestly, it's one of the most terrifying crime sprees in North American history. It's a story that ends in a Winnipeg courtroom, and it's about a man named Earle Leonard Nelson. This is him, Earle Nelson. Back in the 1920s, a terrified public knew him by other names: the Gorilla Killer, the Dark Strangler. Looking back now, he's considered one of North America's very first and most prolific serial sex murderers of the 20th century. And his MO, his method, was just chillingly consistent. It was this terrifying pattern. He would look for a rooms for rent sign, and then he'd show up, looking like this mild-mannered, deeply religious guy who just needed a place to stay. But the second he was alone with a woman, everything changed. He'd attack, strangle them, assault their bodies, and then he would hide them under beds and attics. Then he'd just move on to the next town, pawning their stuff to pay for his ticket. And the speed, my God, the speed was incredible. He covered a huge amount of ground. He starts out in San Francisco in February of 26. By October, he's up in Portland, leaving bodies behind. By December, he's in the Midwest. We're talking about an 18-month reign of terror that cut a path clear across the continent, and it all came to this bloody, dramatic finale in Winnipeg. So, as you can imagine, with bodies piling up across multiple states, the police start to connect the dots. They put out bulletins, just like this one, for the strangle murderer. They described a dark, stocky man with unusually long arms. This thing sparked a massive continent-wide manhunt and a wave of absolute panic. And his bloody tour finally came to an end in Winnipeg, and it was brutal. First, he murdered a 14-year-old girl, Lola Cowan, who was just selling artificial flowers door to door. The very next day, he killed again, murdering a woman named Emily Patterson in her own home. He was finally caught trying to slip back over the US border, but even then, he managed a brief, dramatic escape from a small-town jail before they got him for good.
So when they finally recaptured him and brought him back to Winnipeg, the whole city was waiting. I'm talking a crowd of 4,000 people mobbing the station, just trying to get a look at this guy. Can you even imagine the atmosphere? It must have been this crazy mix of fear, pure rage, and just relief, relief that the monster was finally caught. His trial was incredibly fast. They only tried him for one of the murders, Emily Potterson's, and it took the jury all of 48 minutes to find him guilty. The sentence? To hang.
All right, so we've seen the crime, we've seen the trial, but what about the punishment itself? Let's shift our focus now from the person being executed to the person doing the executing, the hangman.
And this guy is a key figure. This is Arthur Ellis. Now, Arthur Ellis was actually a professional name, a brand, if you will, that he took from his uncle who was a hangman back in England. Ellis came to Canada and basically became the go-to guy, the unofficial official executioner. Whenever a sheriff needed a hanging done, he was the one they called. And yes, he was the man who executed Earle Nelson.
And this is where you see the huge gap between the theory of hanging and the gruesome reality. I mean, the goal was for it to be this scientific process, a quick, clean, instantaneous death from a dislocated neck. But the reality? Well, it could be a total mess. Botched executions meant slow strangulation, or worse. Arthur Ellis's own career came to a crashing halt after a horrific mistake. He was given the wrong weight for a woman named Thomasina Sarau. The drop was too long, and when the trapdoor opened, she was decapitated. Just awful. It's also kind of fascinating to understand what the job actually was. A hangman wasn't some government official. He wasn't a civil servant with a pension. He was basically a freelance contractor, a tradesman selling a very particular, very grim service. And because of that, they almost always worked in total anonymity.
Okay, so that brings us to our final chapter. How did this all end? We're going to look at the long, winding, and really contentious political fight that led to Canada completely abolishing the death penalty.
And yeah, this did not happen overnight. It was a slow, step-by-step process. It starts in 1961 when they split murder into two categories, capital and non-capital. Then in 67, they tried a 5-year experimental ban, but only for certain murders. Killing a police officer or a prison guard was still on the table. That ban got extended in 73. And then finally, in 1976, it was officially abolished for all civilian crimes. The military followed suit much later in 1998.
And you have to see this to believe how divided the country was on this. The debate in Parliament was fierce. You had one side arguing that it was the ultimate deterrent, for the worst of the worst, and the other side was terrified of the possibility, the irreversible tragedy of executing an innocent person. So when it finally came to a vote in 1976, look at this. It was unbelievably close. It passed by a razor-thin margin of just 6 votes, 130 to 124. 6 votes. That is how close Canada came to keeping the death penalty.
So you might be wondering, what happened to the people who were actually on death row when the law changed? Well, they became known as the Lucky 11. On July 14th, 1976, there were 11 men waiting to be executed, and when that vote passed, all of their sentences were automatically changed to life in prison. A stroke of luck, you could say, decided by just 6 votes. And so the gallows across the country, like this one right here, Headingley Jail, just fell silent. They're still standing at some places, these stark, quiet symbols of a really profound and controversial change in the justice system. An entire apparatus of death just taken apart, piece by piece.
Which really leaves us with one final thought. One last question for you. When you look at an empty gallows like this, are you just seeing the end of a dark era? Or is it maybe the start of a new, ongoing debate? A debate about justice, about punishment, and about what it really means to be a society that decides not to execute its own citizens.